With the release of the August 2024 ban list, most competitive players are wondering what's next for them and their deck building. So if you're looking for what hand traps are the best ones to play in your deck for the upcoming format, then you're in the right place. What's up guys, my name is Tcg Sam, and today's video I'm going to be going over the top hand traps for the upcoming format post August 2024 ban list, taking into consideration the different decks that will likely rise to the top of the meta and how these hand traps fare against them. So if you guys enjoy this type of content, be sure to let me know by leaving a like, commenting, and subscribing. But with all that being said, let's hop straight into it. So the very first card is going to be Ash Blossom and Joy Spring. I still think that this card is very easily a main deck staple in every single deck out there that chooses to play hand traps. I think not only is Ash very solid into most of the meta decks right now, it trades pretty well into decks like Yugioh, since you can Ash something like Samsara D Lotus, which commits their normal summon. Against the Fiendsmith engine in general, you're able to Ash the Requiem, which can completely cut them off from the engine itself. And while the engine may not be as strong as it was before, I still think that this is a very key part of a lot of decks in the meta. Of course, there are other matchups like Tenpai, where if you Ash them, their consistency was reduced by the last ban list, so there's a chance they won't be able to play through it as often. So just all those different applications of Ash, I think, make it very strong. Not to mention the fact that it has the ability to stop the Mulcharmy cards, which are very important for combo decks that are trying to pop off turn 1, so that they don't give their opponent like a bunch of draws. So I think Ash's utility just being good into many decks, and its ability to stop cards like Mulcharmy make it one of the best cards in the format. Next up is Dimension Shifter, and Dimension Shifter I think is definitely still a main deck worthy staple if your deck is able to play it. It's still good against the top decks in the meta aside from decks like Runic Stun and Tenpai. It's very good into pretty much everything else. It's still going to single-handedly win you games against some of these top decks out here, and until it gets hit, I think it's definitely going to be a main deck staple for the decks that can play it. Next up is Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries. It wasn't great last format. I don't think it's super good this format, even though there are going to be quite a few decks still playing the Fiendsmith engine. I think that the only decks that are even going to consider Cherries are the decks that don't need their extra deck at all and are able to cover a wide variety of matchups by playing Cherries. So, for example, if a deck just doesn't need their extra deck like Labyrinth, maybe I could see them playing key cards like Phantom of Yubel, the Fiendsmith cards, or like Sangenpai Binding Dragon, just to be able to hit it out of those top meta threats extra decks. So I'm going to put it at like potential side deck staple. I think it could be a solid card in certain circumstances, but generally I feel like there are just other hand traps that are just going to be a lot better. Next up is Contact C, and Contact C I think is still a pretty bad card. There's really no reason to be playing this card in my opinion. Against all the top decks, it doesn't really do anything at all. Maybe you can argue against Tenpai, it could be okay since its level is a little strange. It's like a level 6. It doesn't work very well with the deck. But I think the biggest problem with Contact C is that there are just so many generic links running around in the top decks right now that Contact C is just going to never really affect your opponent enough to where they would need to go super out of their way to out it or something like that. So I think for that reason, probably not worth it. There are definitely better cards to side against most decks. Next up is Dogwood, and I don't really like this card, but I do think, unfortunately, it is a sort of mandatory side deck staple just because of the current time rules. Especially now with the ban on Lacrima, I think that a lot more people are going to start playing this in their side decks just for time, since they don't have an in-engine way to win in time anymore. And I think that if other people are playing Dogwood, you are at a pretty big disadvantage if you don't play Dogwood yourself. There is some merit to saying this card is actually not that bad outside of time, but I think for the purposes of deck building, you're probably going to consider Dogwood as a time card and a time card only, but it does fulfill that role very well, and it probably is the only realistic card that most decks could be playing to win in time. Next up are the Bystials, and I think the Bystials are the hand traps that changed the most from last format to this format. I think the Bystials this format are a bit weaker than they were before, where Bystial was pretty much always insane because every deck was going to the Fiendsmith engine. But now with the Fiendsmith engine getting hit, it's definitely possible that not as many decks will want to use it, or it just won't be as powerful anymore, and people will want to run other hand traps to anyways to stop the main engine of those meta decks. So I don't think that the Bystials are as strong as they were before, but that being said, I still think that they're very strong cards, especially in a deck that can play the Fiendsmith engine, because these are still level 6s, they're free bodies to make Moon into Requiem, and of course they can still hit the Fiendsmith cards, which decks are going to still be playing, like Yubel and Snake Eyes. So I definitely don't think the Bystials are bad by any means, but I think they might be relegated more to the side deck as opposed to the main deck compared to last format. Next up is Droll and Lockbird. I think Droll and Lockbird is very strong in the upcoming format because of how powerful a deck like Yubel is going to be. In the last format, Droll was not very good against Snake Eyes, but it was a lot better against Yubel. And I think that now, after the ban list, Yubel is probably going to be better than Snake Eyes, at least until the new Azamina support comes out. But until then, I think that Droll is probably going to be something you want to consider maining, if not definitely main decking. So I'm going to be putting it in the potential main deck staple. The only reason I'm not putting Droll in definite main deck staple is because there are a few decks it isn't super great against. Decks like Tenpai is not very good against. Runic Sun, of course, is not very good against. It's like meh against Branded as well. So there's a lot of different decks that it doesn't necessarily hit, but against the decks it's good against, it's very strong. So I think that if you want a hand trap that might be able to solo a matchup like Shifter, Droll is definitely that hand trap to consider. Next up is Phantasme. I think that Phantasme is in a similar spot as it was last format. It can be pretty solid in certain decks to help you dig for key hand traps like Ash Blossom or Droll and Lockbird. And I think that its position doesn't really change this format. I'm going to put it at like near the bottom of side deck staple. There might be other cards you would want to consider over Phantasme, like actual hand traps. But Phantasme is definitely not a bad card by any means. It's a free body for the Fiendsmith combo. It gives you targeting protection, which is pretty huge. And of course, it's just actually a pretty decently big body to help you swing over threats as well. So definitely one I could see some decks putting in their side deck. Next up is Infinite Impermanence, and I think that without a doubt, it's still a main deck staple like Ash Blossom. It's just one of the most generic and applicable hand traps ever, like Ash Blossom. It's always going to be good going first or going second. So I think that every deck that's going to be playing hand traps is ultimately going to be playing Impermanence as well. So not much to really say about that there. Next up is Mulcharmy Perulia, and I think this card is kind of polarizing in the sense that some people think it's insane, some people think it's terrible. I'm personally in the boat that I think it's a pretty good card. Put it at the top of a side deck staple. I think that not every deck's going to be choosing to main Perulia, of course, because it doesn't do anything when you go first. But I think that when you go second, this can be a very strong card against the top decks out there, especially against Yubel, because Yubel has the potential to summon like maybe 3, 4, even 5 times from their hand in a combo. And I think that just having such a strong card that can target those top decks, and I think that you're pretty much always going to be happy to be seeing Perulia against those decks. Even if they only give you one draw, it's still not the worst thing in the world because it may end up hindering their combo. So I do think that Perulia has the potential to be a very strong side deck card. If you're playing Tenpai Dragons, you can probably main deck it and it'd be okay, but for most other decks, I think it's definitely a very solid side deck card. Next up is Retaliating Sea. I don't really like this card and I don't think it's very good. I don't know if there's any super important cards this format that you would ever be able to trigger Retaliating Sea off of. Off the top of my head, I think it's just Branded Fusion right now. So I don't think this is a very worth it card. I would probably put it at like top of not worth it. Maybe there's some very niche case that I'm missing that where it could be good, but I don't think it's a very good card at the moment. Next up is Skullmeister, and I think Skullmeister is in a similar boat as well. While it does have the potential to hit more decks, I just don't think it's, as a hand trap, it's high impact enough, so I'm going to put it in the not worth it tier. I think that they're definitely hand traps that you would rather be playing before you ever choose to put Meister into your deck. Next up is Nibiru. Nibiru, I think, has gotten a bit stronger from last format because now Appaloosa's banned, so a lot of decks aren't going to have a generic way to put up monster negates before they super hard commit into their combo. You can say that, decks can't just go into the Fiendsmith engine and then from there try to set up DDD Wave High King Caesar. And while yes, that's possible, there are still decks that want to actually use the Fiendsmith engine to further their plays. So I don't think that Nibiru is going to be stopped as often as it was last format since there's no Appaloosa anymore. The only thing I will say about Nibiru as well, though, is against the Yubel deck, it's kind of hit or miss because Yubel does have a very easy in-engine way to play around it with Phantom of Yubel. So I guess do keep that in mind when you choose to play this card, but I think I'd probably put it in potential main deck staple as well. I definitely think it's very strong now that Appaloosa is gone. Like I mentioned, so many decks are just not going to have a good way to protect themselves from this card, and they're going to be losing to it a lot more often than they were before. Next up is Chaos Hunter. I don't think Chaos Hunter is very good. There's nothing super crazy that requires banishing right now that you need to stop, so I'm just putting in the not worth it tier. I think eventually there will be a format where it's good again, but for now, it's not very good. Next up is Ghost Mourner, and I think that Ghost Mourner is a decent card as well. It was very good against the Snake Eyes deck because Effect Negation just was the go-to way to stop that. But now that Snake Eyes is taking a bit of a hit, and I think that it's going to be a little less popular, I probably put this at like side deck staple. It's still definitely an okay card as well, very applicable into every matchup. I do think that overall it has gotten slightly worse just because Snake Eyes has taken a fairly solid hit, and at least from what I've heard from people testing the Snake Eyes deck post ban list, it isn't really as good as it was before the ban list until at least we get the Azamina cards. So until then, I think that Mourner is probably a decent side deck staple. Next up, we're getting into the Psyframe cards now. Gamma, of course, is very strong, but it's one of those cards where it's very high risk, high reward because you do have to play the driver in the deck. And I don't think that every deck has the ability to play this very well, aside from maybe like Tenpai Dragons, where you'll definitely know it'll be live when you go second. I think it probably go under potential side deck staple. It's just too hard for most decks outside of Tenpai to justify playing this because of the brick, especially if you're not playing the other Psyframes as well. Potentially, if you choose to play the other Psyframes in your side deck, these are, of course, very strong cards, but I think if you're just trying to play Gamma alone, it's probably not worth it, and they're probably better cards to put instead, unless your deck can take advantage of like the discard, using Driver as discard fodder very well. Similar boat with Delta and Epsilon. I would say that these two, of course, are just strictly worse than Gamma, but they can have their applications as well. Maybe Epsilon is not worth it, in my opinion. There aren't any super crazy traps that you'd want to hit right away, since most of the huge blowout traps are flipped after you already commit stuff to the board. So I don't think that Epsilon is super great. Delta, like I mentioned, is worse than Gamma, but maybe has some more applications because it does stop like key spells like Brand Infusion or Bonfire and things like that. Next up is Lancia. I think Lancia is probably not worth it. Like with Chaos Hunter, there's nothing super crazy you need to stop from banishing, so I don't think it's very good this format. Next up is Effect Veiler. I think Effect Veiler is definitely just a solid main deck staple. While Snake Eyes did take a hit, Effect Veiler is still one of the most applicable hand traps in any format, and I think that the flexibility that it has compared to Mourner, where it's not once per turn and can hit normal summons, is very good, and I do think that it can be solid against most of the top decks out there, especially now that Tenpai has lost 2 copies of Sunken Summoning. There's just more decks that you're able to hit now with this card, and for that reason, I'm going to put it in the potential main deck staple. Maybe there are other higher impact hand traps you want to play before Veiler, but Veiler is definitely not a terrible choice. Next up is Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit. I think Ghost Ogre is in a very interesting spot because of how powerful it is against a deck like Yubel. Because hitting a card like Nightmare Pain is so huge against the deck, hitting the opening of the Spirit Gates is also huge as well. Cuts off their follow-up, cuts off their extension. Hitting Nightmare Pain might be able to cut off their entire play as well. So I do think that Ogre has some merits this format. It isn't generally as good into the other decks in the format. Like, there are applications against most decks, but I just don't think that these applications are super high impact and make Ogre worth playing, in my opinion. I'm gonna probably put it at like the bottom of side deck staple. You can definitely make an argument for siding it, and I think that it has a lot of potential, but until we see where the format goes, I don't think that this is a card you want that most players are going to consider playing in their side deck. Next up is Vados, and for those of you who don't know what Vados does, essentially it's a quick effect. Destroy one of your opponent's field spells, give them this monster, and then if it's sent to the graveyard, it'll nuke your opponent's monsters. So it's a very unique hand trap. While there are still powerful field spells like Nightmare Throne, Sunken Summoning, and Divine Temple of the Snake Eyes, I just don't feel like Vados as a card is super high impact enough, because all these field spells are not like the end-all be-all for these decks. Like, if they do lose the field spell, it's not like their deck just crumbles right away. You can still play these decks without these field spells, so I don't think that Vados is good enough, in my opinion, to be worth playing. So I'm going to be putting it at like the top of not worth it tier. Maybe one day this card will be good, but for this upcoming format, I don't think it's very strong. Next up is Ghost Bell. Ghost Bell is also a very mediocre hand trap, in my opinion, for the upcoming format. It has some applications against the top meta decks, like you could still hit cards like Flambird, you could still hit cards like Fadra, but I don't think it's high impact enough against those most relevant decks. So for that reason, I don't really think it's worth playing unless you have a very good reason to put it into your side deck for very specific matchups. Next up is DD Crow, and I think DD Crow is also in a similar boat as the Bystials, with the Fiendsmith cards maybe running less rampant, and with decks like Yubel, Tenpai, and Snake Eyes not really losing super hard to this card. I'm gonna probably put it at like the top of potential side deck staple. I still think Crow is actually a very decent card because it is able to do fairly well against most decks, but I just don't think it's high impact enough. Finally, we have Dominus Purge. I think Dominus Purge is of course a very strong card if your deck can play it, so I'm just putting the potential main deck staple. For the decks that can play it, I probably choose to main deck it just because of how potentially strong it can be as just a very good standalone hand trap that doesn't trigger cards like Triple Tactics, Thrust, or Talents. So that's going to do it for this tier list. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment section below. Do you agree, disagree with what I said? I want to also hear what you think about these hand traps, so do let me know in the comment section below. But with all that being said, I just want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Take care.